Let's continue now into the other two regions of the forebrain, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is an egg-shaped region inside the forebrain. There are actually two of these, two what we call ovoid masses, one on the left and one on the right. The thalamus is found at the superior end of the brainstem, tucked underneath the cerebral hemispheres. Now remember, just because the thalamus is located deep inside the brain, it contains both gray and white matter. The thalamus has two important functions. Number one, the thalamus is called the gateway to the cerebral cortex. And that's because all of the neural pathways that are coming up through the spinal cord in the ascending tracts, all of that sensory input, or at least nearly all, has to pass through these thalamic nuclei, the gray matter of the thalamus, before they go into the cerebrum. So the thalamus has input onto all of the sensory information that's traveling up to the cerebrum. The thalamus also plays a key role in the decision-making about motor output, since most of the motor pathways that are going to travel from the cerebral cortex back down through the spinal cord have to pass through these thalamic nuclei as well. The second function of the thalamus is that it plays a role in the limbic system. Remember, the limbic system is found entirely in the forebrain. The amygdala and the hippocampus are part of the cerebrum. Then we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus involved in the limbic system. The limbic system, remember, is a very primitive portion of our human brain. It plays a role in memory. It plays a role in our most basic, most primal emotions, things like fear and pleasure and anger. It's also involved in our most primal sexual responses. So our sex drive, the act of copulation, the act of ejaculation, and orgasm are all regulated by the limbic system. On this slide, we can see drawings that show us exactly where the thalamus is located. If we look from the side of one of the hemispheres, we can see this large sort of oval-shaped mass that sits right on the superior end of the brainstem. If we look at a frontal section, we can see the left and right hemispheres, the corpus callosum, and then these two oval or egg-shaped masses. This is the thalamus. So remember, there's one on the left side and one on the right side. The hypothalamus is the last and smallest part of the forebrain. The hypothalamus is located anterior and inferior to the thalamus. Like the thalamus, it's a collection of gray matter and white matter. And for its very small size, as you'll see in a minute, it certainly has a long list of functions. We've actually talked a little bit about the hypothalamus earlier in the course. We mentioned the hypothalamus as the control center for the process of negative feedback that helps control our core body temperature. The hypothalamus has 5 distinct functions, including regulating body temperature. But the number one function, the most important job that the hypothalamus does, is it acts as the major control center of the combined neuroendocrine system. Remember, the human body is governed by a combination of the nervous system and the endocrine or hormonal system. And the hypothalamus is the major controller of those systems. It's going to help control the autonomic nervous system, particularly, and the endocrine glands throughout the body that secrete hormone. We'll talk more about this in just a minute. The other functions of the hypothalamus are regulation of our emotional balance, regulation of food and water intake, and regulation of our sleep-wake cycles. As you can see, the hypothalamus is involved in some of the most critical processes that keep us alive. Now let's take a deeper look at this role that the hypothalamus plays as the master controller of the neuroendocrine system. The hypothalamus performs this job in conjunction with a small gland that is located just inferior to the hypothalamus itself, and that gland is called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is actually attached to the hypothalamus, although it is a separate structure. The pituitary gland secretes hormone that is critical for growth, metabolism, reproduction, and control of the stress response. In this drawing, we're looking at one of the cerebral hemispheres, and we're looking at the most interior surface of it. You can see the cerebrum here. You can see the corpus callosum cut right here. Here's the thalamus, located on the superior end of the brainstem. If we go anterior and inferior, we can find the hypothalamus. And located inferior to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. Two very small structures, the hypothalamus, which is part of the forebrain, and this pituitary gland, which is part of the endocrine system. The second function of the hypothalamus was regulating emotional balance. And what is meant by this is when it does its work as part of the limbic system, the hypothalamus is going to help to regulate those primal emotions, anger, fear, even happiness, sadness, very generally speaking. We've discussed that the hypothalamus is involved in regulating body temperature. Remember, it's the control center in the stimulus control pathway for the regulation of core body temperature. It's the hypothalamus, in other words, that receives the incoming afferent information about where body temperature is and how it is changing within the normal range. And it's initiating either cooling signals or warming signals. Remember, the effector structures for the regulation of body temperature include sweat glands, those tiny erector pili muscles that are in our skin, blood vessels in the skin, and even the larger skeletal muscle groups. When the core body temperature starts to rise, the hypothalamus initiates cooling by stimulating the sweat glands to sweat and capillaries within the integument to dilate and release heat. When the core body temperature starts to drop, the hypothalamus is going to initiate warming through vasoconstriction to retain heat and erector pili muscle contraction to create goosebumps. And when the body gets particularly cold, the hypothalamus will also stimulate skeletal muscle groups to contract, causing shivering, which will help generate warmth. Here's another drawing of these two very important structures, the hypothalamus and the nearby pituitary gland. Again, we have a cut surface of cerebral cortex, corpus callosum. Here's the thalamus in green, the hypothalamus in an orange color, and the nearby very small pituitary gland hanging by a stalk from the hypothalamus. The fourth function of the hypothalamus is to regulate food and water intake. The hypothalamus is receiving incoming sensory information about changes in blood glucose levels. Remember, blood glucose, like most variables, has a normal range. And within that normal range, there's a set point. When blood glucose levels start to change within that normal range, that is the stimulus. And depending on which direction blood glucose is changing, whether it's going up or down, that information will be sent along afferent pathways to the control center, to the hypothalamus, which is going to initiate change through either hunger or satiety-related hormones. Hunger, of course, is going to stimulate us to consume food that will help raise our blood glucose, whereas satiety hormones will make us feel more full. We will stop eating, and that will help lower our blood glucose, in addition to the release of the hormone insulin, which is going to help blood glucose enter our cells. The other thing that the hypothalamus is sensitive to is changes in the solute concentration in our blood. Again, there's a normal range for how much dissolved substances should be in our blood. When solute concentration goes up, it signals that we are becoming dehydrated. When solute concentration starts to go down, it signals that we have plenty of water, maybe even too much. It's an increase in solute concentration that is going to stimulate thirst through the hypothalamus, which will trigger us to drink. Finally, the fifth function of the hypothalamus is the regulation of our sleep and wake cycles. Remember, like most animals, human beings have circadian rhythms. We are capable of responding to environmental changes in light and dark in order to know when we should be awake and when we should lay down and sleep. The hypothalamus is going to help regulate those circadian rhythms through the activity of the pineal gland, which is sensitive to light, and the adrenal gland, which produces our stress hormones, as well as others. We're going to switch gears now and leave the forebrain and start a discussion of the midbrain. Among the three functional divisions of the brain, the midbrain is the smallest. It contains only the upper portion of the brainstem, or the midbrain. So the midbrain of the brainstem is what composes the midbrain functional division. The midbrain structurally is what connects the forebrain to the hindbrain. It's small, but it's extremely complex. In terms of the functions of the midbrain, it's involved in processing and integration of information about vision, about hearing, and involving the movement of the eyes and other muscles. In this drawing, you can see the brain stem here and the thalamus sitting on top of it. The first portion of the brain stem, as we travel from the thalamus down towards the spinal cord, the first region is the midbrain. Now, despite its small overall size, the midbrain has very complex anatomy. We're not going to dive into the most complex structural organization of the midbrain, but there are a couple of things we need to be familiar with. When we move from anterior to posterior in the midbrain, we're going to move through three areas. The first is called the tectum, the second is called the tegmentum, and the third is called the crus cerebri. So remember, the brain has mirror symmetry, left and right. So we're going to see two regions that are called tectum, two that are called tegmentum, and two that are called crus cerebri. And you can see those here. Tectum, most anterior. Tegmentum, in the middle. And then the crus cerebri, most posterior. It's the tectum that's involved in the movement of the eyes, as well as some auditory processing. The tegmentum contains a region called the cerebral aqueduct and the periaqueduct gray matter. This region is important because it's involved in our ability to suppress pain. And the crus cerebri contains two deep gray matter nuclei, one called the red nucleus and one called the substantia nigra. These are important because the substantia nigra integrates a lot of sensory information about how our body moves. It's also the place where dopamine is synthesized. So it's the substantia nigra that becomes affected in people who have Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder, and it comes from a lack of the neurotransmitter called dopamine. Damage to or degeneration of the substantia nigra nuclei is what leads to the reduction in dopamine that causes Parkinson's disease. Now we'll move on to the hindbrain. The hindbrain, remember, includes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The pons is located anterior to the medulla oblongata, anterior and superior to the medulla oblongata. The pons is most well known as the place where several of the cranial nerves either begin or end, either exit or enter the brainstem. These are the cranial nerves number 5 through number 8, and are involved in things like facial sensation, facial muscle movement, movement of the eyes, hearing, and even balance. The other thing that the pons is known for is containing a portion of what's called the reticular formation. Now, the reticular formation stretches out through several regions of the brain and is involved in the regulation of what's referred to as wakefulness. There's one particular subset of nuclei, gray matter nuclei, inside the reticular formation that are called the reticular activating system. It's the reticular activating system that helps keep the brain alert at all times. In other words, in a healthy person, the brain is never really off. Even when we're asleep, the brain is on at a certain level of alertness. And that's so it can continue to integrate sensory input. Now, when we are resting, when we are sleeping, our level of alertness is reduced. And that's because the reticular activating system can help filter out the sensory information that's coming into the brain. On this slide, we're looking at a diagram of how the reticular formation and within it, the reticular activating system are distributed throughout the brain. The reticular formation you can see here in green and blue. A good portion of it lies here in the pons. But fibers that are emerging from this portion are stretching out throughout all of the rest of the brain. And that's because the entirety of the brain needs to remain at least partially awake, at least partially alert at all times. The reticular formation is like a web or a reticulum, a mesh of gray matter. It's considered to contain over 100 individual neural pathways or neural networks. It runs throughout all levels of the brainstem. It occupies space between the white matter and the gray matter nuclei in the brainstem, and it connects those areas with many areas of the cerebrum. So, this reticular formation has 5 separate functions. As we said, it's involved in keeping the brain awake and alert, even during sleep. So it plays a role in sleep and consciousness through that reticular activating system. But it's also involved in somatic motor control. It's the reticular formation that helps to adjust, for example, the muscle tone that is so critical in our muscle. It helps us with our balance and our posture. It relays signals between the eyes and the ears to the cerebellum to help integrate vision and sound with the coordination that helps us stay in balance on our feet. The reticular formation is also involved in the control of the cardiovascular system. And it's connected with the cardiovascular centers that are in the medulla oblongata, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. The reticular formation is involved in pain modulation. It's one of the pathways that transmits the sensation of pain to the cerebral cortex. It's also, again, the origin of the descending efferent motor pathways that help suppress pain. And finally, the reticular formation is involved in a process called sensory integration, and this relates to its role in wakefulness. Sensory integration are the neural processes that allow the brain to ignore certain sensory inputs, what we would think of as repetitive, inconsequential stimuli that we simply don't need to pay attention to during the day. On this slide, we can see another drawing of the reticular formation. Again, the bulk of it can be seen here in the pons, although it does extend down into the medulla oblongata and up into the midbrain. You can see the many neural pathways that are extending to various regions of the cerebrum. And of course, both the eyes and the ears play an important role in the function of the reticular formation. Inferior to the pons is the medulla oblongata. It begins, in other words, at the lower end of the pons and ends at the foramen magnum of the skull, where the spinal cord begins. That means that the medulla oblongata is the first portion of the brain that the spinal cord connects to. All of the nerve fibers, all of the ascending tracts that come up the spinal cord into the brain have to pass through the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata receives sensory information about things like touch and pressure and temperature, as well as taste and pain. In terms of its motor output, it's quite extensive. The medulla oblongata sends efferent motor signals to control things like chewing and salivation, swallowing, gagging, even vomiting are controlled by the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is also the control center for the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. And it's because of these two functions that injury to the back of the skull can be so very serious. When people receive a blow to the back of the head, oftentimes the result will be swelling of the brain, and particularly the brain stem, including the medulla oblongata. The problem with that kind of swelling is that there simply is no room inside the bony skull for the brain to swell very much. There's just no space for the brain to occupy as it swells. Remember, the medulla oblongata exits the skull through a hole called the foramen magnum, and it becomes the spinal cord. When the brain swells, particularly when the medulla oblongata swells, that opening to the spinal cord is an exit point. And unfortunately, in certain types of trauma to the back of the head, that medulla oblongata will actually herniate through the foramen magnum of the skull. It will actually push through the foramen magnum and become seriously injured. The effects of that can be on respiration and cardiovascular function, and often lead to death. We'll finish up our discussion of the brain by talking about the last portion of the hindbrain, which is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is actually the largest portion of the hindbrain. Remember, it makes up about 10% of the entire mass of the brain, but it contains more than half of the 14 to 16 billion neurons that are in the brain. So clearly, the cerebellum plays a very important role to the functioning of the brain. When we look at the cerebellum, it almost looks like a miniature brain because it has a surface cortex of gray matter and an underlying collection of white matter, just like the cerebrum does. It has left and right hemispheres, but those two hemispheres are not connected by a corpus callosum. Instead, they're connected by a structure called the vermis. That word vermis translates as worm. So the early anatomists that were examining the cerebellum thought that the tissue connecting the two hemispheres looked something like a worm. Each of the hemispheres of the cerebellum has these parallel folds on it. Those are referred to as folia. And these individual folds are separated by shallow sulci, just like we see in the cerebrum. So while the cerebrum has gyri and sulci, the cerebellum has folia and sulci. And you'll see that the folia look quite different from the sort of disorganized look of the gyri. The last thing for us to recognize structurally in the cerebellum is this. On a cut surface, the white matter of the cerebellum looks an awful lot like a plant branching out. Some have described it looking like a fern. And it got the name, this pattern got the name of arbor vitae, or tree of life. On this slide, we can see a couple of drawings of the cerebellum, particularly as it relates to the rest of the brain. Over here on the right, this represents the spinal cord, and as it ascends, it's going to travel through the medulla. Here's the pons, here's the midbrain, and then we have cerebrum, and here is the cerebellum. Now, On the cut surface here, you can see that we have these raised ridges and these shallow grooves. The ridges are called folia and the grooves are called sulci. The gray matter overlies white matter, just as it does in the cerebrum. Over here we have kind of an unusual cut through the cerebellum. Look first, though, on the outer surface. This is what I meant when I said that folia look very different from gyri. While gyri tend to look sort of disorganized, the folia are very organized into parallel folds. So folia with sulci between them, gyri with sulci between them. And the last thing to notice is how the white matter branches out into the folia. To some people it looks like a tree or maybe a fern with its individual branches stretching up into the folia. This pattern is referred to as the arbor vitae. When we look at the functions of the cerebellum, there are really too many for us to list. Too many individual functions that this important part of the hindbrain performs. But we can group those functions into 3 distinct categories. The cerebellum is primarily involved in coordinating the skeletal muscle movements throughout the body, coordinating balance, and coordinating posture. There are some disease conditions in humans and other animals that affect the cerebellum. And some of the primary signs and symptoms of that kind of disease are problems with these 3 functional categories. People who have sort of incoordinated, unbalanced movement of their legs, especially. People that are unable to maintain an upright posture. People who are generally unsteady on their feet. Those people are diagnosed with the term ataxia, or an inability to move normally and in a coordinated manner. When individuals show that kind of ataxia, physicians will often look to the cerebellum for injury or disease.